Good evening. Tonight, the Forbidden Dispensary is starting with something deceptively gentle, a tiny shard that tastes like comfort, yet has quietly redrawn the outlines of human existence. Strip away the candy-coated nostalgia. The real story of sugar is sown through conquest, the smoke of plantations, coerced labor, and the rise and ruin of empires. If you were dropped without warning into the sugar belt, onto a Caribbean plantation under a vicious sun, or onto the feverish docks where sugar was weighed and sold, you'd realize survival there was never straightforward. Bodies, landscapes, and entire economies were rebuilt around that pale crystal. Before we sink too deep into this, tap like and subscribe if this kind of history keeps you watching. Drop a comment telling the Forbidden Dispensary where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's wild to watch people gather here from every time zone. Mute your notifications. Take one deep breath. Let's begin. High on the damp green shoulders of New Guinea, where the air tastes of loam and salt, people first grasped a stalk that was more than just another reed. It was a promise. A cane full of sweet, thick sap that tasted like captured sunlight and filled the mouth with an almost indecent pleasure. They chewed it, just as kids still do when they snap off a stalk from a field, pulling the bright juice out until their teeth ached and their tongues turned sticky. They mashed it between hands and stones and discovered that the cloying liquid could be poured off and carried in gourds. Over generations, people learned that some canes were sweeter. Some held their sweetness longer, and that if they split a stalk and let it lie in the sun, it thickened into syrup. Those tiny repeated choices, saving the most flavorful stalks, keeping the juiciest shoots for planting, favoring thick-jointed stems over thin ones, are what domestication looks like when viewed in slow human time. A centuries-long conversation between people and a plant, in which both sides change to better meet each other's needs. Modern botanical and genetic research has traced the family tree of Saccharum with reasonable clarity. Saccharum officinarum, the thick-stemmed species that became the parent of most commercial cane, flowers out of New Guinea and nearby parts of island Southeast Asia. Its wild relatives fanned outward, Saccharum spontaneum in the wet plains of the Indian subcontinent, other cousins scattered across Polynesia and mainland Asia. Microscopic plant residues, phytoliths, caught in ancient soils, and the fossil words buried in Austronesian languages. Malay tebu, related Polynesian words for cane, tell the same story the DNA does. This was a plant that traveled with people in boats, tucked into the same hulls that carried pigs and pots, spreading as the great seafaring cultures of the Pacific and Indian Oceans kept pushing their horizons. Archaeological sites in the New Guinea highlands. The places where early taro and banana were grown, such as the famous damp clearings and wetlands, often cited as proving grounds for agriculture, in that world hold faint echoes of this. Reworked soils, repeated plantings, seeds and cuttings saved from the sweetest canes. There is no single eureka moment, no lone inventor. There is a slow accumulation of decisions in which sweetness keeps winning because it feeds children better, softens bitter medicines, and can be given as a gift. At first, the use was direct and practical. Chewing was the first refinery. The mouth was the mill. Human teeth and saliva began the work of extraction and partial fermentation. Then came stone and wood presses, simple rollers that squeezed juice from the fattest stalks into clay or bark containers. With that came a new realization. Once cane juice was freed from the living plant, it did not keep. Time and heat became the earliest tools of preservation. Boil the juice and water escapes, the liquid thickens, sugars concentrate. In different places, people chose different finishing points for this boiling down. In New Guinea and parts of Southeast Asia, the thickened sweetness might be poured into leaves, left to cool and firmed into dark, soft blocks that could be slung from rafters or carried as offerings. Elsewhere, it was the syrup itself that traveled, sealed into gourds and traded along coasts by canoe. The long chain of actions that would much later be denounced and celebrated as sugar manufacture, concentrating, clarifying, crystallizing cane juice, began as a string of small, local fixes to one recurring issue: how to make this extraordinary thing portable and durable. We can still glimpse those choices in both the archaeological record and the oldest surviving texts. Vedic literature composed centuries before the Common Era and compiled across the Indian subcontinent contains an unmistakable term: ikshu, sugarcane. It's not dropped in as a casual plant reference. It's named in the economy of offerings, foods, and ritual goods. Later Sanskrit medical texts connected to the Ayurvedic tradition, the compendia and treatises evolving across the first millennium, CE record sweet sap as nourishment and as medicine. Physicians and surgeons writing for real practice in sick rooms and in the field treat sugar not just as a flavor, but as a pharmacon, a substance that calms, preserves remedies, and helps balance the bodily systems they call doshas. Sugar also seeped into everyday generosity. It was something you could divide and share, pack and transport. A portable sweetness you could hand over as a token or drop into a ritual bowl as prasad edible blessing. From those lowlands and marshes, cane moved west and north with people who were, in many ways, the first long-haul agriculturalists, Austronesian sailors and traders. Their voyages, a millennia-long procession of outward journeys and new island settlements, carried yams, taro, bananas, and sugarcane into the far corners of Southeast Asia and beyond. At every landfall, local tinkering resumed. In the floodplains of the Mekong, along the rivers of what's now Vietnam and Thailand, and in the island chains of Indonesia and the Philippines, methods that began as chewing and hand-pressing grew more elaborate. Earthenware pots deep enough to hold the juice of many stalks. Hearths managed to produce steady, controllable heat. Craftsmen's eyes trained to spot the exact moment when thickening syrup would set into a paste. The results took on local identities. In some places, dark, grainy jaggery. Elsewhere, smooth pastes used to glaze and preserve. In other regions, primitive sugars that would later be coaxed into recognizable crystals. India, with its dense populations, long agricultural lineage, and urban centers of scholarship, turned this scattered experimentation into something more deliberate. Cane there was grown in managed plots, timed to monsoon rhythms and watered through small-scale systems of earthen bunds and channels. Administration sat behind agriculture. Granaries and treasuries had reason to pay attention to a plant that could be transformed into a commodity whose mass and shape made it simple to tax and ship. In classical and post-classical periods, Indian agronomists and bureaucrats carefully recorded varieties, yield expectations, and best practices, building a body of pragmatic knowledge that others would later copy, twist, and carry elsewhere. Some early revenue documents explicitly list cane as a taxable crop. Planting it became an economic act, not just a domestic one. The most consequential breakthrough in the subcontinent, though, was the shift from syrup and paste to something crystalline. Making a sugar crystal is, at its core, a slow performance of control. You push the juice to supersaturation, strip out or bind up impurities that would disrupt clean crystal lattices, then allow crystals to form, sometimes seeding them deliberately. Indian sweetmakers learned to coax cane juice into distinct, transportable grains that could be shaped, stored, and traded. They called this gritty, stony product shakara word, meaning gravel or pebbles. That term would travel with the stuff itself as it left South Asia. Another word, khanda, meaning a broken piece or chunk, referred to the small, firm lumps into which sugar was often cast. Both terms did heavy lifting in physical trade and in language. Traders carried them along with their cargo, where they were reshaped into Persian and Arabic, then echoed into Mediterranean tongues. We know of these Indian processes not just from residue on old pottery and hearths, but from Indian texts themselves. Sanskrit medical and technical works detail sugar's properties and its preparation. Travelers' accounts, written by those moving through ports and marketplaces, note the sugar of India's coasts as both delicious and economically important. Greek and Roman writers also heard second-hand descriptions from merchants. Theophrastus and, later, Pliny the Elder mention a sweet reed from India, though in fragmentary terms heavily veined with rumor. By around the first millennium CE, Indian skill at extracting, clarifying, reducing, and crystallizing had turned sugar into a genuine commodity, no longer a purely local delight, but an item meant for export. In the workshops of the subcontinent, specific solutions hardened into habit. Copper and iron pans were used for boiling. Clarifying agents were added to make the syrup bright and help separate molasses from sugar. Later agronomic texts mention lime-calcium compound as a clarifier, and chemistry backs that up. A bit of alkali helps precipitate impurities. Millstones, then roller presses, wrung juice from cane more efficiently. Oxen, water wheels, and later other power sources spun these machines. Molds, cones, cylinders, simple forms let thickened sugar cool into shapes that could be handled and transported without falling apart. Every step solved a logistical headache. Cane spoiled fast, travel was slow, markets were far away. The sugar that survived would be the sugar that could sit in storage and withstand the journey. This know-how did not stay Indian for long. As Islamic empires rose and Muslim merchants knitted the Indian Ocean into a dense exchange network, sugar flowed east to west. Arabs had tasted Indian sugar through trade long before they industrialized it. But the Arab conquests and the trade routes they boosted, especially after 712 CE, when the Umayyad general Muhammad ibn Qasim reached Sind, intensified contact. Merchants, engineers, and scholars crossed between ports with a fluidity that surprises modern assumptions about the Middle Ages, carrying seeds, tools, and recipes alongside spices. Shakara became shakar in Persian and sukar in Arabic, a tiny echo of the larger transfer of technique and appetite. Once Arabs and Persians had watched cane being grown and processed, they began to adapt. Major centers of the early Islamic world, Baghdad, Basra, Fustat in Egypt, Raqqa, and later Cordoba in Al-Andalus, became not only hubs of trade, but sites of hands-on innovation. Arab engineers and agricultural writers set up larger cane mills, driven by water wheels or animals, able to crush more cane in less time. They refined heating systems, cascading juice through a series of kettles so it thickened in stages. They developed new clarifying tricks that produced lighter, cleaner sugar. Arabic treatises on agriculture, later translated into Latin and European vernaculars, describe cane cultivation, field layout, irrigation, and processing in surprising detail. The 12th century agronomist Ibn al-Awwam in Al-Andalus, for example, wrote at length about sugarcane, planting methods, watering, and the technical steps of boiling and drying, revealing both inherited Indian ideas and local Western Islamic innovations. Water control was crucial. The sweetest cane needs flooding at some points and dryness at others. It is not a casual crop for rain-fed fields. Islamic hydraulic engineers deployed qanats, norias, and complex irrigation networks across the Fertile Crescent and the Nile Delta, turning them into cane landscapes. In Egypt, the Nile's cycles were disciplined and directed into cane plots. In Mesopotamia, Sasanian and Abbasid canals were repaired and stretched farther. By sometime between the 9th and 12th centuries, a belt of sugar regions lay under Islamic political umbrellas. The Nile Delta and Fayoum, stretches of southern Iraq, the Levantine coast, and parts of Iberia. These changes weren't only technical, they left fingerprints in language and ritual. Words for sugar across dozens of Middle Eastern and Mediterranean languages trace this path. Shakara to shakar to zukaro to sugar. Kand or kanda, Persian term for crystallized sugar feeding into romance forms, and eventually into candy. The sweets of medieval Islamic society, early halva-like confections, fruit preserves, syrups, showcase a deep familiarity with sugar's ability to preserve and transform other foods. Hospitality customs, medicinal recipes, and everyday cooking folded sugar into their fabric. In turn, sugar's own production took on a more organized scale. Sugar houses near cane fields, mills with distinct roles, and the first faint outlines of a factory system. From North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, both the product and the craft seeped into European awareness. Late antique and early medieval Europe knew sugar only dimly. Roman texts spoke of a strange honey-like Indian product, and a trickle of syrup may have made its way to the wealthy. Honey remained the default sweetness, but Islamic control of the Mediterranean brought sugar closer to European elites. Sicily and Al-Andalus became the main corridors. In Sicily, Muslim rule beginning in the 9th century, after the Aghlabid invasion around 827 and consolidating over the next generations, brought intensive agriculture, irrigation systems, and agronomic expertise to the island. Sicilian conditions, warm climate, fertile soils, sophisticated irrigation made it ideal for cane. When Norman conquerors took Sicily in the 11th and 12th centuries, they were less interested in crushing the existing agricultural system than in taxing it. They kept much of the administration and left sugar as a key export. Sicily became a historical hinge where Islamic technical achievement passed into Christian-controlled territory and then bled into broader European economic life. On the Iberian Peninsula, Al-Andalus, with its irrigated lowlands around Seville, and the Guadalquivir emerged as another European sugar nursery. The rulers of Córdoba and later the Taifa kingdoms had already promoted cane and sugar making. Sugar became a prize for local merchants and international traders alike. When Christian kingdoms pushed southwards in the centuries-long Reconquista, they sometimes conquered complete sugar economies and folded them into new regimes. These systems would later be replicated elsewhere as states, dynasties, and borders shifted. The Crusades, beginning at the end of the 11th century, added one more route for sugar into Western consciousness. Knights, merchants, and pilgrims in Levantine port cities found sugar woven into urban diets, abundant in markets, grown in gardens, and present in medicines and sweetmeats offered by hospitals and courts. They took either sacks of sugar or a fierce craving for it back home. Crusader states on Cyprus and along the Levantine coast became fresh centers for cane cultivation. Their climates and irrigation potential suited it. When Richard the Lionheart seized Cyprus in 1191 and then sold it on, the island's new rulers recognized its potential for sugar. Over the next centuries, the Lusignan kings nurtured plantations that helped feed Europe's expanding sweet tooth. Trade routes flexed to accommodate this. Genoese and Venetian merchants, the master networkers of the medieval sea, found considerable profit in hauling sugar from eastern ports and island refineries to northern Italy and beyond. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Venice had become the key hub, its docks and warehouses the filter through which sugar reached princely households farther north. Sugar was pricey to move. It was heavy, bulky, and fragile. Loaves were cast specifically to handle sea voyages and still arrive in sellable shape inland. For a long time, sugar remained an urban and aristocratic indulgence, rationed for medicine, spectacle, and a certain idea of taste. Apothecaries were among the earliest European professionals to import sugar in any volume. They valued it both as a supposed curative and as a way to disguise the bitterness of drugs. Sugar's reputation as medicinal sweetness, bolstered by Islamic and classical medical texts, made it a legitimate expense. In medieval Europe, sugar's meaning was as social as it was chemical. Where households once relied on mead and honey for sweetness, the ability to serve sugar signaled access to long-distance trade, wealth, and a worldly palate. On elite tables, sugar was used architecturally. Poured into conical molds, it hardened into tall loaves. Candied fruits and spiced nuts, coated in gleaming sugar, were stacked like miniature cities. The art of the subtlety sugar sculptures, displayed between courses at late medieval and early Renaissance feasts, worked as edible heraldry. A sugar fortress at your banquet didn't just impress. It announced your command over the far-flung systems that had brought that sugar to your hall. Those displays melted on tongues, but their message stuck. Meanwhile, more sober uses continued. Monastic infirmaries, city pharmacies, and court kitchens made sugar-based medicines and preserves that let fragile fruits survive across seasons. Sugar's hygroscopic nature, its knack for attracting and holding water combined with its ability to inhibit microbial growth, made it ideal for syrups, electuaries, and cordials. Physicians in the Galenic tradition, often reading Arabic commentaries, and figures like Avicenna prescribed it for specific conditions. Latinized medical literature carried these recommendations across universities and literate religious circles. Sugar embedded itself in Europe's learned culture as much as in its kitchens. Logistics, always the quiet engine of any economic revolution, dictated where cane could be grown and who could profit. Cane had to be milled within hours of cutting. Pressing and boiling demanded fuel, water, and specialized labor. Finished sugar required secure storage and dependable shipping. These constraints turned sugar making into a coordination-heavy enterprise. In Sicily and Al-Andalus, existing irrigation systems and complex landholding arrangements made cane feasible. In Cyprus and pockets of the Levant, coastal humidity and easy access to shipping made sugar estates profitable. But even where the environment cooperated, sugar demanded capital, strong merchant networks, and governments willing to protect and tax an industry that intersected commerce at many points. That's why early European sugar production clustered along busy trade arteries and within polities that could support and skim from such a business. Sugar's arrival also reset expectations of what wealth should taste and look like. Where a noble table had once been judged by its game, its wines, its vinegar and salt, now it also flaunted a new substance, white, crystalline, foreign, that implied connections beyond the local horizon. Sugar rose as a luxury, then seeped slowly down into broader patterns of consumption over centuries. Merchants and rulers understood the alchemy of scarcity. A pinch of sugar at a feast seasoned the dish and also the host's reputation. As appetites rose among Europe's courts and merchant elites, the supply web stretched and thickened, from fields in India and the Islamic world to Mediterranean brokers, to Venetian and Genoese storehouses, and on by river and road into the markets of France, England, and the Low Countries. Step back from this long chain, and the pattern becomes both straightforward and vast. A swamp grass domesticated in island wetlands became a carefully managed crop and a technical art in South Asia. That art was shared and revised by Islamic engineers and entrepreneurs. From there, sugar entered Mediterranean Europe as both medicine and exotic luxury. Throughout, the same logistical demands, water for cane, mills for crushing, fuel for boiling, ships for transport, defined where sugar could thrive and at what environmental and human cost. Sweetness that began as juice in a reed had, by the medieval era, become a crystalline system, a technology of concentration requiring capital, organization, and the cultivation of new tastes. It's easy, speaking softly at the end of a long day, to sentimentalize this path, to imagine each step as a quaint discovery. But there's a hard irony running through it. From the very beginning, sweetness was also a large-scale problem. To make sugar into something that could supply a city, sweeten medicine, and appear as a showpiece at banquets demanded more than clever cooks. It required hydraulic engineers, builders, bureaucrats, traders. The reed a child chewed on by a New Guinea stream was the seed of a global commodity network because people chose to make that sweetness portable. Once that decision hardened into habit, it began reshaping landscapes, diets, and power structures in ways no one involved at the start could have imagined. The reed became a lump. The lump became a loaf. The loaf quietly began rewriting human needs and hierarchies. From small coastal gardens in the Pacific and generations of selection to the simmering vats of Indian crystallizers, through the mills and canal systems of the Islamic world, and into the grand tables and dispensaries of medieval Europe, sugar traveled physically and culturally. It entered Europe as a rare substance and left as a promise that sweetness could be standardized, taxed, and sailed across oceans. The echoes of those choices, agricultural, technical, commercial, were still ringing, and the taste that had taken root among elites would prove remarkably contagious. When the first sugarcane cuttings crossed the Atlantic, they didn't arrive as curiosities. They arrived as a business proposal, a proposition about land, labor, and the appetite of distant markets, along with the price human beings would pay to satisfy that appetite. Sugar was already a Mediterranean and Asian staple, cultivated and refined by Arabs, Venetians, Iberians. By the 15th century, Portuguese planters had turned islands into machines on Madeira, and with unsettling speed, on smaller Atlantic stepping stones like the Canaries and Azores. Those early island estates were prototypes of a new agricultural order. Forests were stripped away, terraces carved, mills rose to crush green stalks, labor was marshaled around the blazing clocks of the boiling house. The pattern set on Madeira large monocropped estates, heavy investment in fixed machinery, deep dependence on coerced work, would be copied and enlarged until it bent entire continents to its rhythm. After 1492, that transplant sped up. Columbus and those who came after him didn't invent the idea of cane in the Americas. They delivered it to soils not yet exhausted by centuries of war and intensive farming, and to regions whose indigenous populations, shattered by disease and conquest, could not supply the labor sugar demanded. Spain and Portugal had already rehearsed the model on small Atlantic islands. Now Spanish settlers on Hispaniola and Cuba, Portuguese in Brazil, French planters on western Hispaniola, and later the English and Dutch in the Caribbean. During the 17th century, all looked out over wide green rows of cane and saw the straightest path to ready cash. By the 1520s, working mills dotted the Caribbean. By the late 16th and 17th centuries, a new Atlantic map had taken shape. Madeira and São Tomé provided early experience. Pernambuco and Bahia in Brazil became major engines. Barbados, Jamaica, Saint Domingue, Martinique, Cuba, each island and coastal plain became a crucible where European capital and tropical ecology fused into something single-minded and unforgiving. This wasn't random, it was strategic. European merchants and colonial administrators recognized that the world's taste for sweetness could be turned into a steady stream of bullion. Imperial machinery, royal charters, land grants, trade monopolies, fleets sailing triangular routes between Europe, Africa, and the Americas reorganized the Atlantic basin into a single economic loop. Sugar was perfectly suited to that loop. It stored well, traveled easily, fetched high prices in Europe's status-hungry markets, and scaled up neatly. One estate with a proper mill could output more value than many small grain farms. What began as a luxury crop for the well-to-do rapidly became the first truly mass-produced tropical export, the commodity whose scale demanded new arrangements of land, labor, and credit on both shores. The ecological fallout came quickly and clearly. Forests vanished, not in the blaze of war, but under the cool logic of profit. On dense Atlantic islands and Brazilian and Hispaniolan coasts, planters felled canopy to plant cane in straight sun-baked rows. On Barbados, thin topsoil poor from the start wore away under relentless planting. Microbial life and humus washed off in the rains. In Saint Domingue, cane fields crept across plains and up slopes, wooded hills shaved into terraces of cane. In Brazil, the sugar frontier marched inland, chewing through the Atlantic rainforest as estates migrated from exhausted coastal soils to fresh clearings. The pattern kept repeating, fertility dropped, so planters cut more forest, shifting operations or abandoning choked-out land. The cascade included erosion, silted rivers, and the collapse of local biodiversity as hedgerows and native plants were replaced by one hungry crop that fed markets but starved the local web of life. Monoculture carried its own slow poison. Cane devours soil nutrients. Planted year after year with no rotation, yields shrank. Pests and diseases, once contained by varied landscapes, found uninterrupted highways of cane. Mills and boiling houses that had adapted to patchwork fields now stood at the centers of near-endless green seas. The fields looked peaceful until harvest, when the sheer labor needed came into sharp relief. Environmental reshaping fed directly into new social structures. Landholdings grew contiguous and consolidated. Common lands and varied plots gave way to fenced plantations. Property became long rectangular fields feeding into central factories' mills. Boiling houses glowing with furnace heat. Curing sheds where sticky raw sugar slowly dried. The plantation itself became a machine built of earth and human bodies. That machine demanded labor, and across the Atlantic sugar regime that labor was organized through coercion on a staggering scale. From the 16th century onward, the plantation system imported huge numbers of enslaved Africans. The numbers matter because they reveal the size and method of the system. Over roughly 3 centuries, historians estimate 12–13 million Africans were forced aboard Atlantic ships. About 10–11 million survived to reach the Americas. Transporting human beings became an industry in its own right. European merchant fleets, coastal forts, inland raiding networks. Manufactured goods, textiles, metal goods, alcohol, firearms streamed from Europe in exchange for captives. Ports like Liverpool, Bristol, and Nantes grew rich on this traffic. Lisbon, Amsterdam, Bordeaux also formed key nodes. Merchants there financed ships, insured cargoes, and insured people as if they were barrels of rum or bales of cotton items on a ledger to be lost, partially recouped, or fully written off. The Middle Passage became a central link in this Atlantic web-binding European capital, African intermediaries, and American estates in a chain of contracts and violence managed with grim efficiency. Slave ships sailed circuit routes, stopping at multiple African ports to fill their holds, then aiming for the Americas along timings tuned to wind and current. The logs read like cold spreadsheets: tonnage, carrying capacity, premiums, percentages lost. Mortality, often 10–20%, appeared as a controllable risk, something to be minimized only so far as profit required. In colonies where plantation life was particularly brutal and disease-heavy, enslaved populations could not sustain their own numbers. Many Caribbean territories became dependent on constant new shipments just to maintain workforce levels. Once captives disembarked, sugar's demands shaped their lives and deaths. Planters experimented with different labor regimes to wring maximum output from broken bodies. In much of the British Caribbean, the gang system ruled. Groups of enslaved workers, driven from dawn until dark, under watch and whip, moved in line through the cane fields, their pace set by overseers who prioritized speed over survival. In places like parts of coastal South Carolina and sometimes Cuba, a task system assigned specific workloads once finished, the worker might have a sliver of personal time. On Brazilian and Spanish Main estates, hybrid forms evolved, colored by local law, existing indigenous labor structures, and the skills enslaved Africans themselves brought. Seasoning, the cruel process of breaking in new arrivals, acclimating them to plantation routines, eroding their strength through overwork and poor diet, became standard. Mortality on many plantations was so high that enslaved people were treated almost as a continuously expendable input, rather than as long-term investments. Demographics tell the story. In the late 18th century, Saint-Domingue, the French colony on western Hispaniola, was the richest colonial property in the Americas because of its sugar and coffee output. By then, it held around 500,000 enslaved Africans and their descendants, working a near-total monoculture that delivered a huge share of Europe's sugar. Its returned wealth was visible in elaborate port warehouses, ships stacked with barrels, grand planter estates. But that wealth rested on constant human replacement. In many British Caribbean islands, enslaved populations did not for a long time reproduce fast enough to replace deaths. Life expectancy for an enslaved field hand newly arrived might be brutally short under conditions of heavy labor, tropical disease, and minimal care. Only in a few mainland regions, notably the American South, did enslaved populations grow enough via births to reduce dependence on imports, a difference shaped by climate, disease patterns, and labor organization. You cannot describe this Atlantic sugar order without seeing how it reshaped Africa itself. The slave trade was not just large-scale plunder, it restructured African states and economies. Coastal and inland polities grew powerful or collapsed, depending on how they engaged in capture and sale. The Asante in the Gold Coast, Dahomey on the Bight of Benin, the Oyo Empire, and many smaller entities fought wars, raided and captured in order to supply European buyers. Firearms came back in exchange, shifting military balances and making conflict more lethal. The demographic distortions were severe. In some areas, the removal of men created gaps in labor and family structures. In others, the selective targeting of certain ages and sexes warped societal patterns. The deeper consequences lingered. Economies oriented toward human export, legacies of violence and division that would shape politics long after the formal trade ended. Plantations were, paradoxically, also places of new cultural creation. Under violent pressure, people from different African cultures, European settler groups, and indigenous communities blended languages, religions, and practices into new Creole societies. These communities invented new tongues, spiritual systems, music, and politics out of the fragments they carried with them. In Haiti, this gave rise to Haitian Creole and Vodou. In Brazil, candomblé and samba rhythms. In Cuba, Afro-Cuban religions like Santeria. Along the southeastern U.S. coast, Gullah communities preserved distinctive speech and crafts tied to West African roots. Culture doubled as resistance, letting people smuggle identity and meaning past planter control, forging community in the very spaces designed to erase it. Open resistance took many forms. Everyday acts, intentional slow work, sabotage of tools and mills, feigned illness, secret gatherings, chipped at plantation control, maroon communities, settlements of runaway enslaved people sprang up in remote hills and forests. Palmares in Brazil survived nearly a century, resisting Portuguese and Dutch attacks before being crushed in 1695, and its leader Zumbi became an enduring symbol. Large uprisings punctuated this history. The Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, 1739, Tacky's War in Jamaica, 1760, and above all the Haitian Revolution, 1791-1804. Led by figures including Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Haiti's revolution wrecked a massively profitable sugar colony, ended slavery there, and forced every empire to recalculate. Power responded with law. Colonial legal codes tried to stabilize slavery and racial hierarchy. France's Code Noir of 1685 outlined rules for slavery in French territories, mandating Catholic baptism, defining enslaved status, codifying punishments while still leaving broad powers in masters' hands. Barbados's 1661 Slave Code and follow-up laws hardened British colonial notions of property, race, and violence. Spanish and Portuguese empires used their own intricate systems of caste and manumission. These laws did more than describe reality, they created it, entrenching race as a key category and later feeding pseudo-scientific racism. Meanwhile, the technical drive of sugar production never stopped. Early Atlantic mills were crude, a set of wooden rollers powered by mules, oxen, or hand labor, squeezing juice from chopped cane. Portuguese colonists called these complexes engenhos engines because they married field and factory. Wherever possible, water wheels were turned to this purpose. Where wind was reliable, windmills went up, like the ones that came to dot Barbados. The Dutch, during their ascendancy in parts of Brazil and the Caribbean, brought advanced engineering to these mills, raising throughput. But every pre-industrial power source had limits: wine's fickleness, animals' fatigue, water's dependence on local terrain. Cane's need to be processed quickly after cutting made any delay costly. What sugar needed was controllable, powerful, on-demand motion. Steam delivered that. The British Industrial Revolution provided a new heart for the sugar mill. James Watt's late 18th century improvements to the steam engine and the spread of steam power by early 19th century meant plantations could install engines whose rotation was steady and strong, regardless of weather. Richard Trevithick's high-pressure designs, appearing in the early 1800s, allowed for more compact, durable engines. By the 1820s and 1830s, steam-driven mills were appearing throughout the Caribbean, in Cuba and in Louisiana. Steam reorganized the sugar factory. Mills became larger and more centralized. Engines required machine shops and skilled mechanics. Keeping equipment running demanded specialized workers: boilermen, engineers, blacksmiths. Capital requirements shot up. A sugar estate now had to be equal parts farm, factory, and financial operation. Output climbed, unit costs dropped, and estates that could not or would not mechanize fell behind. Refining technology also advanced. The old method, boiling juice in open kettles until crystals formed, wasted sugar in molasses and ruined some with excessive heat. Early 19th century innovations altered this. Vacuum pans and multiple effect evaporators allowed concentration at lower temperatures. Norbert Reuillet, a Creole engineer from New Orleans, born in 1806, studied in Paris and, by the 1840s, created a multiple effect evaporator that dramatically improved efficiency, using steam in stages to concentrate juice with less fuel and lower risk of scorching. Implemented in Louisiana sugar houses, Reuillet's system cut fuel consumption, reduced the need for kettle labor, and increased yield of crystallizable sugar. Technical progress with direct social implications by removing bottlenecks and allowing larger operations. Centrifugal machines marked another leap. Spinning rapidly, they separated molasses from crystals, speeding the final stage of turning raw sugar into a more refined product. Combined with better clarifying agents, centrifugals let producers generate whiter, more marketable sugar, quickly raising competitiveness in European markets, where color and purity drew higher prices. Later in the 19th century, diffusion methods using hot water to leach sucrose from shredded cane instead of crushing it further upped extraction efficiency. Collectively, these shifts transformed sugar making between the late 18th and mid-19th centuries from a series of craft-like steps to a heavily mechanized, capital-intensive factory process. Machines didn't erase human labor. Cane cutting, in particular, remained brutal handwork into the 20th century, but they changed where and how labor was used and what skills it demanded. Mechanization reshaped social and financial relationships on plantations. Large steam mills and advanced evaporators required sizable upfront investment and ongoing credit. Planters increasingly depended on European banks and merchant houses. Estates were mortgaged, bonds were sold, fortunes intertwined with financiers in Liverpool, Paris, Lisbon. In the Caribbean and Cuba, foreign capital from Britain and France flowed into sugar. Cuban planters often partnered with British and French firms to buy engines, boilers, and ships. The result was the rise of vertically integrated sugar companies, entities that owned cane fields, mills, refineries, and shipping lines. Controlling each link in the chain reduced transaction costs and concentrated profits and power in fewer hands. After emancipation movements began, mechanization had political weight. When Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in most colonies in the 1830s, planters lost their legal pipeline of new enslaved labor. Some responded by doubling down on machinery and consolidating estates. Others sought new ways to lock in labor, importing indentured workers from India and China, instituting debt peonage, and using contract structures that came close to slavery in practice. In Cuba and Brazil, where legal slavery persisted deep into the 19th century, Cuba not abolishing it until 1886, investments in machinery meant that when emancipation finally came, some sugar complexes could pivot to wage labor and survive. In the American South, a different path unfolded. The enslaved population increased via births, and mechanization progressed more slowly. The planter elite remained powerful into the Civil War, and Louisiana's sugar refineries and mills continued to rest on massive enslaved labor forces until Union victory destroyed that order. There's a jarring symmetry here. The same refined, snow-white sugar that floated in porcelain bowls on breakfast tables across Europe, sweetening tea and coffee for growing populations, was the end product of systems that concentrated capital and mechanization while spreading ecological ruin and breaking human lives. Steam engines, vacuum pans, centrifuges increased sugar per acre and per worker, but only by drawing in more capital and skill, binding plantations into global finance. Success or failure became as much a function of credit and insurance as of rain and sunlight. The land, meanwhile, remained the mute witness. Machines couldn't heal degraded soils, they often pushed frontier clearing faster. By making per-unit sugar cheaper, mechanization made monoculture especially dangerous. Entire regions tuned themselves to a single crop, becoming acutely vulnerable to price crashes. When world prices fell, over-leveraged estates failed, were sold off or consolidated, and the cycle of boom and bust rolled on. Across the 18th and 19th centuries, sugar's story was a compound reaction. Simplify ecosystems to increase yields. Larger yields demand more land and labor. Labor comes from the forced migration of millions. Technology intensifies production and capital concentration. And the Atlantic Basin becomes a theater where plantations serve as both sites of extraction and symbols of a world governed by appetite and finance. Ports that once traded olive oil and spices now handled hogsheads of molasses and stacks of refined loaves destined for diets that would no longer reserve sugar for the elite. Sugar crossed the line from luxury to staple, spice to industrial ingredient. It powered distilleries, sweetened factory diets, and underwrote other trades, especially rum, which became both commodity and currency in the triangular trade, used to purchase more captives in Africa. All of this rests uneasily together. The inventiveness of engineering improvements, the navigational precision that timed slaving voyages to seasonal winds, the legal frameworks that dressed slavery in procedural language while bureaucrats tallied customs duties and insurance claims. Names recur in the record: James Watt at the dawn of steam, Richard Trevithick pushing high-pressure engines forward, Norbert Rillieux redesigning the boiling house, Toussaint Louverture leading rebel armies in Saint-Domingue's hills, Zumbi defending Palmares in Brazil. Cities and regions carry these marks. Liverpool's docks, Nantes' sugar warehouses, Recief's harbour, plantation mansions overlooking their fields like small palaces. Each new machine or administrative reform shifted the scale at which sugar could operate. Each revolt, each law, each ship leaving harbour changed the arithmetic of empire. Sugar didn't rewrite human history as accident. It did its work through a series of linked choices: plant transplants and colonial gambits, forest clearing and credit extension, the brutal math of human cargo and the efficient spin of a centrifuge. The land remembers in stripped hills and eroded plains. Cultures remember in Creole tongues and blended faiths. Economies remember in port ledgers and bank archives. The boilers and steam lines humming in sugar houses were one set of engines. The deeper engine was appetite backed by credit and political will, keeping plantations running until uprisings, reformers, and new industries slowly rearranged power. Listen closely and you can almost hear it. Not just steam hissing through copper, not just a windmill's creak, but the lower, steadier sound of systems settling into place. Forests turned into straight rows of cane, ships crisscrossing the ocean with packed holds of people and sugar, laws trying to normalize what they could never justify. This is a long, dense tale told in the vocabulary of engineers, merchants, and those who refused. It is, in miniature, human history wrapped around one commodity. A white crystal that tastes simple and sweet, whose backstory is bitter, tangled, and unusually decisive in making the modern Atlantic. The mills in northern England beat like slow drums under a low grey sky. During their long buzzing shifts, the bodies of workers in Manchester, Salford, Preston, and other cotton towns came to rely on a small crystalline thing arriving in sacks and barrels from far-off coasts. Sugar, once an exotic spice doled out in thimblefuls to aristocrats, had, by the later 18th century, become cheap enough to be bought by the spoon. By the mid-19th century, it had become one of the core calories of the industrial working-class diet. In those factory districts, a worker's day often began and ended with tea, and tea unsweetened was thin comfort. A hunk of bread spread with jam and a lump of sugar gave a child just enough courage for another hour on the loom floor. A handful of toffees kept a man's mouth and nerves occupied between shifts. The shift was not just about taste, it was about logistics, strategy, infrastructure. Sugar prices dropped as Caribbean and Brazilian plantations scaled up, as transatlantic shipping specialized in moving sugar, coffee, and coerced labor, and as refining tech improved enough to crank out granulated sugar for urban consumers in enormous volume. Cheap sugar delivered fast energy in a form that fit the new rhythms of industrial life, easy to tuck into a pocket, dissolve in a mug, or hand to a child. It sat quietly at the center of the factory regime. Picture dawn over the mill towns, black chimneys, steam leaking from engine houses, bells clanging shift changes. Women with hair pinned back, aprons dusted with flour and sugar dust. Children's mittens sticky from splitting sweets. Tea stalls set up at factory gates. Tin mugs lined up for gallons of hot tea, sweetened with molasses or a white sugar lump, delivering a quick jolt of carbohydrates to get through a 12 or even 16-hour day. Bread and sugar, tea and jam, the shorthand diet of the new industrial city. The logic was brutally simple. Machines demanded long, steady hours. Sugar provided quick fuel at a cost even a low wage might cover. Employers noticed, social reformers noticed, temperance advocates noticed. Some owners supplied tea to workers, partly to keep them out of pubs, partly to keep productivity up. In Birmingham and beyond, Quaker business families like John Cadbury, who opened a grocery in 1824 and later moved into chocolate-push tea and cocoa as sober alternatives to alcohol. The same Quaker firms Cadbury, Rowntree, Fry-Who came to see themselves as paternalistic benefactors were also surfing the wave of falling sugar prices that made their business model possible. That ordinariness of sugar was designed. In London's Isle of Dogs, the opening of the West India Docks in 1802, championed by merchants like Robert Milligan, was meant to secure and speed the flow of sugar and other Caribbean goods. Liverpool and Bristol, already Atlantic hubs, turned into major refining and redistribution centres, connected by canal and later rail to Britain's growing industrial heartlands. The docks were like distilleries, raw sugar and molasses in, value-added product out, warehouses stacked with loaves and hogsheads, brokers issuing warehouse certificates and bills of lading, the air thick with a mix of molasses, tar, and the faint, sharp scent of sugar dust. Refining itself solidified into big business. Loaf sugar was melted, clarified, recrystallized into granulated sugar meant for regular kitchens. Centrifugals, vacuum pans, better lime clarification all increased throughput and quality. Refineries in London, Liverpool, Amsterdam, and later elsewhere turned colonial raw sugar into affordable white sugar for a widening domestic base. As sugar became steadily available in industrial cities, it rewired consumption habits. In early 19th century Britain, the East India Company still had a tight hold on tea imports, keeping prices high. But by 1833, that monopoly was broken and tea prices fell. Pair cheaper tea with cheap sugar, and the ritual of tea and bread became a daily industrial tool, both soothing and disciplining. A mid-morning cup gave workers a brief, sweet break and a refocus of attention. Coffee houses had long histories in European cities, but the working-class tea culture of 19th century Britain, bread, butter, jam, tea, sugar, became the practical fuel of the industrial body. Sweetened tea worked both physiologically and politically, spiking blood sugar, improving mood, and in the eyes of factory owners and municipal reformers, serving as a buffer against drunkenness and unrest. Temperance groups praised tea for precisely this reason. You could sweeten it with plantation sugar instead of drowning your evenings in gin. Confectionery expanded in tandem. The corner sweet shop became part of the working-class street. Long-standing firms like Fry of Bristol, emerging in the late 18th century, evolved into fully mechanized candy manufacturers in the 19th. Cadbury's small Birmingham grocery turned into the chocolate works that would eventually move to the purpose-built factory village of Bourneville. In York, the Rowntree brothers launched their firm in 1862 and built a confectionery empire. Their chocolates and candies became the small indulgences a factory wage could buy, predictable purchases that allowed these companies to plan and scale. Technological tweaks fit the tempo of industrial life. The sugar cube created in 1843 by Jakub Krzysztof Rad in what is now the Czech Republic, supposedly inspired by his wife's frustration cutting loaves simplified dosing. Instead of sawing at a cone of sugar, you could reach for a lump. Quick, clean, perfectly suited to dim boarding houses and quick breaks. The craving for sweetness reshaped home meals too. Marmalade, commercialized by the Keeler family in Dundee at the end of the 18th century, moved from rare treat to staple, preserving citrus and adding calories to breakfast for those who could afford bread but not rich spreads. Jams, candied peels, bread puddings, toffees in twist wrappers, all made a limited amount of sugar stretch farther, bundling energy into forms that could be prepped ahead and eaten on short breaks. Social and moral commentary followed. Doctors and reformers decried excessive sugar as a threat to teeth and character. But those warnings often lost out to immediate economic realities. A spoon of sugar cost far less than a day's wages, yet bought another hour of focus. The small crystal became lubricant for industrial gears, a cheap indulgence that supported enormous production systems. There's a wry twist here that the Forbidden Dispensary can't ignore. The same commodity that served as Baroque display material for 17th century elites became the quiet ration of 19th century factory discipline. Cheap sugar dampened demand for more expensive forms of leisure while giving rise to entire industries. Confectionery, bakery goods, soft drinks, whose profits folded back into the same industrial economy. Quaker chocolate makers who opposed alcohol and promoted worker welfare simultaneously built brands that depended on sugar's rock-bottom price. Inside cities, this transformation was subtle. Outside, the sugar business roared in counting houses and government ministries. What pulled sugar prices down, what made those spoonfuls fall into workers' mugs, was a half-visible architecture stretching from Lisbon and Madrid through Amsterdam, Bristol, and London. For roughly 2 centuries, sugar trade in many European empires was shaped by mercantilist rules, navigation acts, monopoly charters, state-backed companies. The Dutch West India Company, 1621, the later forms of the English Royal African Company, and the South Sea Company, famous for its Asiento contract granted by the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht, all treated sugar-producing colonies as strategic assets. Navigation acts required that sugar from English colonies be carried in English ships. Sugar was about sovereignty and naval power as much as profit. Tariffs and bounties directed capital toward favored producers and shut out rivals. These weren't mere technicalities, they were political levers that spurred conflicts. The Molasses Act of 1733 meant to protect British West Indian planters by taxing molasses from competing French islands, irritated New England merchants deeply. They relied on cheaper non-British molasses for their rum. Smuggling erupted and contributed to the wider tensions around imperial control. The Sugar Act of 1764, pushed by George Grenville, tightened and revised duties, aiming to draw more revenue from the colonies. Among its many effects was inflaming colonial anger toward Parliament. Sugar policy became one thread in the weave that led toward the American Revolution. Across the Atlantic, Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands repeatedly fought over sugar islands whose plantations yielded faster, more predictable profits than many mainland territories. Naval battles, amphibious assaults, and island swaps in the 7 Years' War, the treaties of 1763, and the Napoleonic Wars reveal sugar's weight in imperial strategy. Financing sugar trade demanded its own innovations. Sugar cargoes were collateral for credit and subjects of marine insurance. Lloyd's of London, which grew from Edward Lloyd's coffee house into an insurance powerhouse, underwrote the risks of Atlantic shipping: storms, piracy, rebellion. The triangular trade rested on layers of credit and bills of exchange, short-term paper promises that could be bought, sold, and discounted by houses in Amsterdam, Bristol, London. That spread plantation risks across investors' portfolios. Merchants like John Gladstone in Liverpool, who, in the early 19th century, acquired Jamaican estates and pumped capital into sugar, epitomize how merchant fortunes transformed into colonial landholdings and then into metropolitan influence. Gladstone later became a major public figure, and his sugar money seeped into property, politics, and polite London life. Sugar markets developed modern-seeming features: brokers, futures-like agreements, standardized warehouse receipts. Amsterdam, with its deep commodity trading history, and London, with its maturing docks and exchanges, handled the paper flows of sugar as much as the physical flows. Credit was the bloodstream. Merchants advanced funds to planters for next year's crop, to ship owners for upcoming voyages. Sugar trade, in turn, bankrolled the institutions that supported further imperial expansion. States understood this. Diplomatic spats like the Asiento controversy, which helped spark the War of Jenkins' Ear between Britain and Spain, 1739, were really about access to Atlantic trade routes and rights. Sugar sat at the center of these arguments. Then major shocks redrew the map. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 onward, obliterated one of the world's most productive sugar colonies. Saint-Domingue had provided a huge share of global sugar before insurgency and the French Revolutionary Wars. Its collapse spiked prices, redirected investment, and pushed other sugar economies, Brazilian, Cuban, British colonial, to expand and fill the gap. Meanwhile, Napoleon's continental system, 1806, and British blockades cut continental Europe off from cane sugar imports, creating acute shortages and prompting political leaders to look for a domestic alternative. Enter beet sugar. Its story begins in quiet scientific curiosity. In 1747, the Berlin chemist Andreas Marggraf identified sucrose in sugar beets. His finding remained mostly a lab note until geopolitical stress made it urgent. His student Franz Karl Achard took the idea out of glassware and into fields, building an experimental beet sugar plant in the Prussian town of Kuenen around 1801, backed by the state. Achard's work showed that beets could yield sugar industrially in temperate climates. Napoleon, facing chronic shortages due to British blockades, latched onto beet sugar as an economic weapon. If France and its allies could produce sugar at home, they could escape British maritime dominance. Imperial decrees subsidized beet cultivation and factories. Industrialists like Benjamin Delessert and technicians like Jean-Baptiste Kerouel improved extraction and boiling methods, founding the first commercially effective French beet sugar works in the 1810s. Beet sugar was more than a technical trick. It was wrapped in rhetoric of independence, modernization, self-sufficiency. Prussia subsidized beet estates and mills. Napoleon's policies pushed French agriculture toward beet. Later, the Zollverein, Germany's 1834 customs union, gave beet sugar extra protection from cheaper colonial cane imports. Railways in the 1830s and 1840s solved one practical headache. Beets are bulky and spoil quickly. Fast transport linked farms to nearby factories, making beet sugar commercially viable. The politics got rough. Cane planters, whose business model relied on their climatic advantage, dubbed beet sugar unfair and lobbied for protection. British West Indian planters, especially after emancipation in 1833, squeezed their profits, pressed Parliament for preferential duties and subsidies. Metropolitan industrialists and merchants had their own agendas. In mid-century Britain, the powerful free trade movement, which also pushed for repealing the Corn Laws in 1846, undermined preferences for colonial sugar. Lower duties made foreign cane cheaper and gave consumers cheaper sugar, but eroded the advantage of British colonial producers. France and Germany went the other way, locking in protection and subsidies for beet. Britain, for a significant period, embraced lower tariffs that gave workers access to very cheap sugar, while leaving colonial planters exposed. Industrial chemistry of beet processing improved rapidly. Early plants were costly and inefficient. By mid-19th century, better liming and carbonation, improved diffusion and boiling, and scientific breeding of beets to increase sugar content transformed the economics. Capital poured into beet sugar factories. Banks, rail companies, industrialists participated. Sugar's social geography changed. No longer solely the domain of tropical landowners and maritime merchants, sugar became a domestic manufacturing business in northern France, Belgium, Germany, and Russia. Russia, for example, built a robust beet sector often reliant on serf or quasi-coerced labor well into the century. As cane production picked up in Cuba and Brazil to replace Haiti, as British Caribbean plantations struggled post-emancipation, as the Dutch extracted sugar from Javanese peasants under the 1830s culture stelsel. Beet factories multiplied in Europe. By late 19th century, temperate countries had enough beet sugar capacity to become major global players. Tariffs, subsidies, and industrial capital made it so. This split tropical cane versus temperate beet was not just botanical, it realigned politics, money flows, and class structures. Plantation owners and colonial merchants formed defensive blocs, insisting on imperial preferences. Industrial capitalists and many consumers often favored cheaper imports and freer trade. World sugar prices now faced downward pressure from both increased cane supply and rising beet output. Price volatility increased. Plantations, built on assumptions of scarcity and high margins, found themselves squeezed. National outcomes varied, but the overall pattern was clear. France and Germany sheltered beet behind tariffs. Britain eventually gave more ground to free trade. British households enjoyed very cheap sugar. Colonial cane producers suffered. Sugar had become two industries with distinct labor systems, capital bases, and political patrons. Cane remained tied to sprawling estates in warm climates, to colonial governance, to debates about forced labor and its successors' indenture, contract peonage. Beet fit neatly into industrial capitalism, drawing on railway networks, chemical engineers, urban banks, and centralized factories. Industrializing nations had found a homegrown sugar that mirrored their broader industrial structure. By the later 19th century, the habit of sweetening the daily cup-borne in docklands and mills had been stabilized by states, merchants, and scientists. Sugar's history in this era is doubled: the micro-history of a spoon in a worker's mug, and the macro-history of joint stock companies, insurance tables, and tariff codes that arranged empires. It's sobering and a bit darkly comic that the same commodity that made a child's bread taste like summer also funded fleets and triggered parliamentary debates. From the floor of Manchester tenements to the quiet of London counting houses, sugar-wired economies shifted diets, financed empires, and inspired national strategies. It became raw material for the industrial city's food, a point of political dispute, and an object of technological rivalry in the factories of Berlin, Rouen, and St. Petersburg. The shift to beet was born in wartime blockade and scarcity, matured through chemistry and rail logistics, and landed in tariff schedules and household budgets. Yet the human scale stayed small. In a Manchester boarding house the year after the West India docks opened, a mother might stir jam into porridge for her child and pack a tin of sugared bread for the mill. Across the ocean in a London office, a merchant might sign papers that extended credit to a plantation another season. In Berlin, a chemist adjusted a clarification process to make beet sugar a shade whiter and cheaper. These tiny acts and vast systems knitted together. Sugar fed the worker and oiled the economy. It sat at the core of a web of trade and policy that made early globalization feel ordinary. By the mid-19th century, sugar was at once everyday and controversial, an unquestioned ingredient at the bottom of the social diet, and a key item on statesmen's lists at the top. The sweet spoonful in a worker's cup connected dockside warehouses to the jargon of finance, treaty articles about trade spheres, and parish ledgers listing sugar loaves among relief rations. It is one of the small bitter truths in this long history. A commodity counted in hogsheads and teaspoons changed how people worked, ate, governed, and fought. Refinement in the counting house was mirrored by refinement in the sugar loaf. A tariff set in a minister's chamber translated into a boy's sugar cube at a factory gate. A beet grown in a Prussian field turned, by way of bones, steam and duties, into a spoonful in a Manchester tin mug. If the world that produced sugar also engineered dependence on it, it did so gently, with a crystalline hand. Tariffs, charters, insurance pools, ship fleets, plantation layouts, factory lines, they all converged into the simplest gesture: someone reaching for a spoon. Behind that spoon sat an engine mercantile, financial, imperial, entirely comfortable, bending law, science, and coercion to keep turning. In that marriage of kitchen ritual and global strategy, sugar remade both palates and geopolitics. The table manners of a family in an English town were really byproducts of treaties and shipping manifests, lab notebooks and ledger entries. In the quiet after the factory whistle, when the city dimmed and a child's tongue still remembered jam and tea, sugar history was still at work, a persistent crystalline force that had reshaped labor, lives, and the world map. For centuries, physicians wrapped sugar in the authority of revered ancients and folded it into remedies as if pleasant taste could soften both cure and transaction. Under Galen's long shadow, his ideas towering over medieval and early modern medicine, sugar entered apothecaries not just as a delicacy, but as a pharmaceutical tool, a carrier, preservative, soothing base. Thick amber cordials, scented with rosewater and citrus, sat next to mortars and pestles in Baghdad, Cairo, Venice, London. Pharmacists poured them out in drams. In Avicenna's Baghdad and in Renaissance Italian courts, sugar won praise for stabilizing delicate herbs, masking the sharp edges of bitter simples, and warming a stomach described in humoral language as cold. Medicines smelled of clove, orange peel, wine, and sugar. The same cordial you might take after dinner simply because it tasted like comfort could also be prescribed for an ailment. This wasn't mere sentimentality. Before refrigeration, preservation was a constant problem. Sugar itself became a technology. Crystallized cane from India and Persia traveled by caravan and ship as a concentrate of both energy and method. In high concentrations, sugar's osmotic power stops many microbes in their tracks. Jam makers in 17th century France and apothecaries in 17th century London relied on the same underlying trick. Packed sugar protected fruit and plant extracts, stretching seasons for the wealthy. Sugar thus became part of the medical toolkit: stabilizer, flavoring agent, trusted tincture base. Taste, tradition, and rarity reinforced each other. When sugar was expensive and limited, when a teaspoon might be shared ceremonially at a feast, its medicinal cachet had logic. But then came the plantation boom in the Caribbean, beet sugar experiments in Napoleonic France, the rise of steam, the spread of cheap refining. Sugar cane output, beet capacity, and machine efficiency all rose. Price fell. What had been an occasional syrup in a doctor's bag became a background ingredient in 1,000 things. The earlier trust in sweetness began to crack. It was dentists more than physicians who first sounded a clear alarm once sugar was no longer rare. The French surgeon-dentist Pierre Fauchard, whose 1728 work, The Surgeon-Dentist, laid foundations for modern dentistry, had already looked skeptically at confections. He saw that sticky sweets clung to teeth, their residues encouraging decay. His observations seemed small, tactile crumbs on enamel, children's mouths, but they pointed toward a more systematic understanding. By the late 19th century, this understanding took shape in the chemico-parasitic theory of dental caries, most famously advanced by Willoughby D. Miller in the 1890s. Miller, an American dentist and bacteriologist working in Europe, argued that oral bacteria metabolize carbohydrates, sucrose, glucose, starches into acids that erode enamel. It was a simple mechanism with far-reaching implications. In populations where sugar consumption rose, cavities would follow. The issue was no longer just about brushing or personal virtue. It was structural. At roughly the same time, nutrition itself began to evolve from loose speculation into a more empirical science. the 19th century catalogued foods and experimented in physiology. The discovery of vitamins, refined in the early 20th century, would later shift thinking again. Improvements in experimental methods, statistics, and epidemiology after World War I let scientists look for patterns across entire populations instead of just single patients. As industrial and post-industrial nations grappled with rising chronic diseases, especially coronary heart disease, sugar quietly entered the discussion. The mid-20th century is where this story becomes polarizing. Ansel Keys, an American physiologist, led the 7-country study through the 1950s and 1960s. Comparing cohorts in the US, Japan, Italy, Greece, Finland, and others, he argued that diets high in saturated fat correlated with higher rates of heart disease. That narrative fit post-war assumptions. Rich Western diets heavy in meat and animal fat seemed to go hand in hand with modern illnesses. Keys became a central voice, shaping official dietary guidelines. Governments and public health bodies advised people to cut saturated fat. Low fat became a marketing magic word. The logic was reductionist to assign a single nutrient as the villain but tidy enough for policy posters and labels. Not everyone was persuaded. In Britain, John Yudkin, a physiologist at Queen Elizabeth College, argued that refined sugar, not saturated fat, was the main dietary culprit behind heart disease and the emerging obesity problem. His 1972 book, Pure, White and Deadly, was half warning, half case file, drawing on cross-country data to show sugar intake rising alongside coronary disease and some cancers. He highlighted metabolic pathways, particularly fructose's impact on the liver. But he found himself isolated. Ansel Keys and others pushed back hard. Yudkin was criticized, sometimes mocked. His views were sidelined at conferences where official policy outlines were drafted. Institutionally, fat remained the ennemi du jour. That had consequences. Policy tends to follow what looks like consensus, especially when that consensus dovetails with commercial interests. Sugar's presence in the 20th century diet was expanding, but its health impact was obscured in a fog of contested studies, conflicting advice, and industrial messaging. As senators, nutrition experts, and food executives wrangled in hearings and committees, avoid fat dominated. Sugar mostly slipped below the line of scrutiny. Meanwhile, production lines hummed. Economic stakes dulled moral urgency. When a commodity supports economies from Caribbean cane fields to European beet cooperatives, immediate judgments that might harm that flow are difficult for states to embrace. Evidence can inform policy, but it can also be contested, delayed, or selectively amplified. So the 20th century unfolded along dual tracks. In some labs and clinics, researchers explored sugar's metabolic roles. In factories, sugar was folded into an ever-expanding roster of products. Older uses cordials, preserves, syrups stuck around, but a flood of new sugar roles appeared thanks to refrigeration, canning, chemical preservatives, multinational corporations, and a revolution in advertising. Technically, the steps were incremental and devastatingly effective. Canning, pioneered by Nicolas Appert in the early 19th century, spread and refined. Pasteurization and sterilization techniques improved milk safety and shelf life. Mechanical refrigeration moved perishables farther, faster. Industrial sugar refining, helped by vacuum pans and centrifuges, cut production costs. None of these inventions were flashy in isolation. Together, they made sweet, stable, portable foods ultra-cheap. Once sugar could be cheaply stored and shipped, it seeped everywhere. Breakfast cereals, breads, jams, canned fruit, bakery goods, candies, ice creams, condiments. It traveled by rail, truck, and ship in bulk, then reappeared in small units, wrapped, boxed, and branded on street corners from Johannesburg to São Paulo to Shanghai. Advertising and mass media then did what mills and docks could not. They rewired taste expectations. Radio, then television, the altars of mid-20th century living rooms became pipelines for corporate storytelling about what meals should be. Breakfast cereals, originally invented as plain, healthy fare by health reformers, were transformed into sugary spectacles. Mascots and jingles framed sweetened flakes and puffs as the right way to start a child's day. Tony the Tiger started roaring for Frosted Flakes in the 1950s. General Mills, Kellogg's, Post, and others learned how to package sugar with cartoon charm. Soft drinks formed the second axis of this transformation. Coca-Cola, created by John Pemberton in Atlanta in 1886, started as a local quirk. By mid-20th century, it had become a global symbol of American modernity. The company's logistical strategy, shipping concentrated syrup and bottling locally, tying distribution to the presence of US troops during World War II, created enduring infrastructure. Pepsi followed, and together these brands colonized markets across continents. Sugar and later high-fructose corn syrup, carbonation and mass bottling formed an everywhere drink. Vending machines in schools, convenience stores on corners, branded fridges in gas stations, giant cups at stadiums. Commercials told viewers that fizz and sweetness equaled freedom, youth, connection. Globalization gave these patterns new reach. Container shipping in the 1950s and 1960s dropped long-distance freight costs. Roads and trucks pushed refined sugar deep inland. At the same time, American-style fast food chains, McDonald's and its peers, spreading rapidly from the 1950s and 1960s onward, paired sugary drinks and buns with new meal tempos. Multinationals like Nestlé, Mars, Kellogg's, Kraft wrapped sugar in the language of convenience and familiarity. The same chocolate bar or cookie could be marketed in Chicago, Nairobi, or Manila, with a similar wrapper and a translated slogan. Industrial chemistry brought a new player, high-fructose corn syrup, HFCS. In mid-20th century America, advances in enzyme technology made it possible to convert corn starch into glucose, then enzymatically convert part of that to fructose, producing a sweetener with similar taste to sucrose. Corn subsidies and sugar quotas made HFCS cheaper than cane sugar in many applications. Soft drinks and processed foods began to swap sucrose for HFCS at scale in the 1970s and 1980s. Metabolically, fructose is handled differently from glucose. It's processed largely in the liver, raising questions about its role in fatty liver disease and other metabolic conditions. Whether HFCS is uniquely worse than sucrose is still debated scientifically. But one thing is clear: pricing and policy, not health considerations, drove manufacturers' choice. As sugar, in one form or another, filled the seams of the industrial diet, public health charts began to slope upward in new ways. Obesity rates climbed. Type 2 diabetes spread. These shifts were not caused by sugar alone, but by a broader nutrition transition. As countries urbanized and incomes rose, traditional diets heavy in grains, legumes, and vegetables often gave way to energy-dense, ultra-processed foods rich in sugar, fat, and salt. Epidemiologists like Barry Popkin mapped this transition, its speed, and its fallout. In a single generation, some nations moved from caloric scarcity to a twin burden: undernutrition in some groups, obesity in others, sometimes in the same family, depending on age and gender. The sweet taste was linked with celebration and convenience, but also with an industrial commodity whose harms were unevenly distributed. As evidence accumulated that sugar was not just an innocent indulgence, the institutions capable of responding found themselves intertwined with the industries that profited from it. Here, sugar's history shifts from boilers and barrels to memos, meetings, and money. Sugar interests had been politically organized since the 19th century. The American Sugar Refining Company, the Sugar Trust, around 1900, Tate and Lyle in Britain. Beet lobbies in continental Europe, cane coalitions in Brazil and elsewhere. These entities had long fought over tariffs, quotas, and subsidies. But in the mid-20th century, industry involvement in scientific discourse took a sharper turn. Declassified documents and historical research show that the Sugar Research Foundation, later the Sugar Association, actively worked to shape the research story. In 1965, the foundation quietly commissioned 3 Harvard nutritionists to write a review on sugar and heart disease for the New England Journal of Medicine. Internal correspondence, later dug up and published in a 2016 BMJ paper by Kristen Kearns, Laura Schmidt, and Stanton Glantz, revealed that the foundation paid the researchers and pushed them to emphasize saturated fat over sugar as the main dietary villain. The resulting 1967 review did just that, minimizing sugar's role and focusing attention on fat. It became highly influential, bolstering the blame fat paradigm for decades. The strategy mirrored tobacco industry tactics: fund research aligned with your interests, amplify doubt about opposing findings, and shape public and policy perceptions. When John Yudkin warned loudly about sugar, he faced professional dismissal and ridicule. When sugar-funded narratives lined up with food manufacturers' desire to sell low-fat but sugary products, they caught a tailwind. Later, similar playbooks appeared on different stages. Beverage giants like Coca-Cola and Pepsi, confectionery firms, and corn refiners learned that the front lines were not just journals, but school curricula, professional conferences, and public messaging. They funded exercise-focused obesity programs, such as Coca-Cola's backing of the Global Energy Balance Network in the 2010s, arguing that lack of physical activity, not diet, was the primary problem. This message conveniently sidestepped any focus on sugar-sweetened drinks. When these ties came to light, they highlighted how independent advice could be shaped by funding. Lobbying and legal maneuvers followed. When cities and countries began considering taxes on sugary drinks, Berkeley in 2014, Mexico at the national level, the same year industry rolled out the full kit. Lobbyists swarming local councils, aggressive ad campaigns warning of job losses, and nanny state overreach sponsored studies questioning policy efficacy. The sugar lobby in the US also fought to preserve tariff structures and price supports that kept domestic sugar prices high and stable, securing farmers' votes while protecting processors' margins. Globally, when the World Health Organization, after extensive review, issued 2015 guidelines recommending that free sugars be kept below 10% of total energy, and ideally under 5%, industry groups and sugar-producing nations protested. They called the guidance premature, economically damaging, and based on weak evidence. Delegations from exporter nations lobbied in Geneva and beyond, trying to blunt or water down the recommendations. Corporate work on the science-politics border has another effect. It erodes public clarity. It's one thing for scientists to argue in specialized journals. It's another when corporations sponsor studies, conferences, educational initiatives, or media campaigns that flood the discourse with mixed messages. Over time, ordinary people learn to see every claim as contested. Confusion itself becomes a commodity, useful in delaying regulation. Occasional scandals pierce the fog, like the 2016 revelations about the Harvard Review, or the exposés of Coca-Cola's funding of ostensibly independent health organizations. Public health voices point to these as smoking guns, showing how policy has been distorted. But scandal alone doesn't automatically translate into rapid reform. Sugar-related industries hold considerable logistical and political advantages. Money, lawyers, PR teams, deep roots in rural economies, jobs. Even as peer-reviewed studies increasingly link sugary drink intake with weight gain, type 2 diabetes, and higher cardiovascular risk, the policy machinery moves slowly. When it does move, the results show what's possible. Mexico's 2014 soda tax and excise that made sugary drinks more expensive led to measurable reductions in purchasing, particularly among lower-income households. Berkeley's penny-per-ounce tax coincided with reduced consumption of sugary beverages. The UK's soft drinks industry levy, announced 2016 and implemented 2018, used a tiered structure. Higher tax rates for higher sugar contents. Many manufacturers chose to cut sugar content to avoid or reduce the levy. These tools are pragmatic, not moralistic. They work through prices, formulations, and shelf positions. They don't solve everything, but they show that when policy leverages the wiring of markets, it can nudge industry behavior effectively. Industry, of course, adapts. Taxes prompt shrinkflation, smaller servings, reformulation with non-sugar sweeteners, rebranding as light or zero, and heavy marketing of better-for-you variants. These moves require new supply chains, recipe tweaks, label redesigns, and fresh campaigns targeting regulators and consumers alike. Because companies pivot quickly, public health policy needs to be iterative and adaptive as well. The last decades of the 20th century and the early 21st have thus seen a tug-of-war. Better science versus sophisticated countermeasures. Evidence about sugar's role in chronic disease continues to accumulate, yet converting that evidence into broad, sustained action is uneven, because commercial interests can wield legal and political tools on a scale that public health agencies often cannot match. Sugar's scientific story, then, is about time and power. For centuries, sugar felt like medicine, part of a doctor's toolkit. Industrial abundance and marketing turned that once rare remedy into a ubiquitous ingredient, then into a major driver of disease. Scientists raised warning flags. Some were dismissed, some co-opted, some ignored. Companies rode the profits offered by technological and logistical change, then guarded those profits through modern political craft, funding, lobbying, litigation, spin. Much of this took place in plain sight, not in deep secrecy, but in a landscape where access and influence were unevenly distributed. The end results are as much logistical as biochemical. Tooth decay now strains public health budgets and affects children's quality of life in ways that map onto class and geography. Obesity and diabetes reflect not only individual choices, but pricing systems. Recipe decisions made in boardrooms and subsidy patterns negotiated in legislatures. Yet the Forbidden Dispensary will end this section not solely on indictment, but on possibility. Public policy, when it chooses to, can rewire the logistics of sweetness. Taxes, reformulation standards, add restrictions, especially around children, mandatory added sugar labels, and nutritional rules for public institutions can all shift what is made and what is eaten. The general direction is clear: make sugary options less cheap, less aggressively advertised to kids, and less omnipresent in spaces like schools and hospitals. Still, a gentle truth remains. Sugar is not just economics and policy. It's also comfort, ritual, memory. Weddings, holidays, religious festivals, birthdays, all lean into sweetness. Any serious public health approach has to move carefully among those meanings, not just around them. So as you settle in and the light fades, imagine sugar's journey. From an apothecary's spoon to a factory scoop, from a healing cordial to a stadium-sized commodity, from personal remedy to public health concern. Picture mills, trucks, shipping manifests, and boardrooms. Picture dentists and lab scientists, brand managers and activists. Hear the quiet clink of glass bottles on conveyor belts and the low, constant hum of a world that first found solace and then danger in a tiny, stubbornly political substance. Sleep on that for a while. The rest of the story: how societies decide to live with sweetness, to regulate it, to soften its harms without erasing ritual, depends on whether we choose to study logistics as carefully as we once studied humors. It depends on whether policy is allowed to chase evidence more closely than it chases money. It depends on whether markets can be nudged toward health. Until then, sugar keeps producing itself at ship and silo scale, and science keeps measuring it, one cautious spoonful at a time. In the muted air before festival lights come on, imagine a woman in Varanasi pressing a warm, fragrant laddu into a child's palm. Its coarse surface, flecked with cardamom and rich with ghee, carries centuries in a single bite. Sugar, ritual, identity. Sweets stand at the center of ceremony, granting permission to be indulgent and devout in the same instant. They are edible punctuation marks for weddings, small daily indulgences, tangible evidence that the sacred and the social have been made delicious. in South Asian temples, mithai barfi, jalebi, rasgulla, gulab jamun moves from priest's hand to outstretched palms as prasadam, blessed food to be eaten quickly and reverently. Modak is offered to Ganesha at the height of Ganesh Chaturthi, a festival revitalized in the late 19th century by Bal Gangadhar Tilak as a tool for public gathering and political mobilization. The dumpling thus becomes both an offering and at times a quiet national symbol. In Lucknow and Kolkata, in narrow lanes where sweet shops have held family names for generations, simply buying a box of sweets is a civic ritual. You line up, taste, trade gossip, and celebrate births or exam results with the same dense sugar. Move west, and the narrative reshapes itself. In the cool courtyard of an Ottoman konak, a tray of baklava sits under an embroidered cloth. Its thin, crisp layers, soaked with syrup and scattered with pistachios, are maps of empire and technique. Palace kitchens at Topkapi trained confectioners to build delicacies in layers and syrup. This knowledge leaked into city streets. In Istanbul, Hacı Bekir opened a shop in 1777, whose locum Turkish delight became shorthand for hospitality itself. During Ramadan, fasting and feasting overlap. Eid al-Fitr is marked with marmul, katayef, and other sweets carried from bakeries to homes and mosques. At Ashura, halva is handed out in big copper pans across parts of the Levant. Sugar here is a social oil smoothing relations between neighbor and stranger, marking remembrance and consolation. East and Southeast Asia developed their own sugar languages, often starting from palm sugar as much as cane, and rice or beans as much as syrup. In China, crystallized sugar decorates Lunar New Year altars. Niangao, the sticky rice cake whose name plays on higher year, symbolizes rising fortunes. Skewers of candied hawthorn tangaloot crack between the teeth on cold streets. In Japan, wagashi delicate sweets tied to seasonal flowers and tea ceremony aesthetics flourished under the stable Tokugawa period, when sugar supplies grew more reliable. Confectioners in Kyoto matched seasonal changes with precise sweets meant to harmonize with the tea bowl and scroll. European powers, missionaries, and traders carried cane and techniques into Macau and the Philippines. Pastel de nata, Portuguese custard tarts, found cousins in flan-like custards across Asia. Spanish friars in colonial Mexico brought sugar mills and European dairy methods, mixing them with indigenous ingredients to produce cajeta and dulce de leche, along with countless regional caramel-like sweets across Latin America. In Europe, sugar's symbolism slid from medicine to courtly spectacle to bourgeois habit. Early modern banquets in Renaissance Italy and France prized sugar sculpture's subtleties, rising like miniature buildings from the table showcasing a host's command over rarity. By the 19th century, sugar had seeped into every corner. It rode along the routes cut by plantations and steamships, then entrenched itself in common kitchens. In Britain, tea did the rest. Anna, Duchess of Bedford, helped popularize afternoon tea in the 1840s, anchoring cakes, scones, and jam in daily English rituals. French chefs like Marie-Antoine Carême in the early 19th century elevated patisserie into high art, building pastry monuments for aristocrats and diplomats. Auguste Escoffier later codified haute cuisine, with patisseries becoming public theaters for sugar's technical prowess. Macarons, millefeuilles, glossy fruit tarts, they all became signals of refinement. Caribbean sweets tell their own layered story of cane, molasses, salt air, and rum through small rituals that hold identity together. Distilleries in Barbados and Jamaica Mount Gay, claiming records from 1703, Appleton Estate from the mid-18th century turned molasses into rum. That rum, in turn, flavored Christmas black cakes, puddings, and breads at the center of celebrations from Bridgetown to Kingston. Sweetness there is both political and personal. Plantation schedules, crop calendars, trade winds all echo in the act of soaking dried fruit in rum for weeks, or in the moment a brandy-soaked cake is lit in a dim room. After Britain's formal abolition of slavery, planters turned to indentured labor. Over 1 million workers from South and East Asia were contracted and transported to Caribbean and Indian Ocean colonies between the 19th and early 20th centuries. They brought their palettes and recipes with them: condensed milk, jaggery, spices combined with local ingredients to form hybrid sweets, barfi made with Caribbean coconut, tamarind balls rolled in sugar, coconut fudges laced with cloves and rum. This creolization tastes like rhythm layered over rhythm: Caribbean beets, Indian textures, African spice memories, Trini sweetbreads, Indo-Caribbean mithai, Guyanese black cake. They're all edible records of plantation kitchens and church basements. In New Orleans, beignets powdered with confectioner's sugar at Café du Monde Serving since the late 19th century site at the junction of French, Caribbean and American sugar circuits, now ritualized as breakfast for locals and a must-do for tourists. In Haiti, the revolution led by Toussaint Louverture toppled the plantation order, but independence came at a price. In 1825, France forced Haiti to accept a crippling indemnity in exchange for recognition. That debt, serviced over decades, drained Haitian coffers and reshaped its sugar prospects. In this story, sugar is not just sweet. It's also a financial instrument, a weapon in punitive diplomacy. Around the world, specific sweets have become national or regional emblems. Arguments flare over rasgulla's origin between Indian states, or over whether baklava is really Turkish or Greek. In Sulmona, Italy, sugar-coated almonds confetti symbolize local pride. When communities argue over recipes, they're often really arguing over belonging. Sweets anchor memory. Apples dipped in honey at Rosh Hashanah ask for a sweet year ahead. In Korea, ritual tea and rice cakes at weddings mark the joining of families. In the Scottish Highlands, tablet a crumbly sugar and milk fudge and shortbread tie modern life to older clan kitchens. Sugar crosses social and economic lines because it was first scarce and then commonplace. It signaled status, then comfort, sometimes both at once. Colonial encounters powered much of this creativity in all directions. Portuguese convent sweets in 17th century Lisbon traveled to Brazil and returned transformed. Egg yolk custards like pastel de nata picked up cousins in Filipino leche flan. Spanish nougats morphed into Turon-inspired rolls in the Philippines. French colonial pastry in Indochina helped birth Vietnamese ban flan. Chinese bakers in Southeast Asia adapted fillings and sweeteners to palm sugar and coconut. Diasporas carried these hybrid sweets even farther. So when public health turned its focus back towards sugar in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, it entered a terrain already thick with meaning. Policies couldn't just tweak prices. They had to move carefully among deeply rooted rituals. Recent decades have seen a range of government responses to added sugars and sugary drinks, each shaped by culture and power. Mexico, facing alarmingly high rates of obesity and diabetes, introduced a nationwide soda tax in 2014, a per-liter excise designed to raise prices and cut consumption. Early data showed an overall reduction in sugary drink purchases, particularly among lower-income households. Berkeley, California, became the first US city to pass a similar measure in 2014. Follow-up studies showed declines in sugary drink consumption there as well. The UK built its soft drinks industry levy differently. Announced in 2016 and applied in 2018, it used a tiered structure. Higher tax rates kicked in above certain sugar thresholds per 100 milliliter. The explicit goal was reformulation. Many beverage companies responded by reducing sugar in their products to fall below taxable tiers, cutting significant amounts of sugar from the national drink supply without waiting for consumer behavior to change on its own. Labeling and advertising restrictions accompany fiscal tools. Chile's 2016 regulations required bold front-of-pack warning labels, black stop sign icons for foods high in sugar, saturated fat, or sodium, banned sales of such products in schools, and sharply limited marketing to children. The result? A transformed visual field in stores and less child-targeted advertising for sugary products. Other countries have implemented traffic light labels or health star systems, with mixed uptake and ongoing debate over their design. Many countries have also tightened school meal standards. In the US, the Healthy, Hunger-Free Kids Act of 2010 revamped nutrition guidelines for school lunches and placed limits on competitive foods and drinks sold on campus, including bans or restrictions on sugary beverages. Overall, evidence suggests that well-designed taxes reduce purchases of sugary drinks and encourage reformulation. Prominent, simple labels improve some consumers' decisions, and school policies limit children's exposure and access. Yet challenges remain. Taxes can appear regressive, hitting low-income households harder in percentage of income terms. However, these same households often show the largest reductions in sugary drink consumption, and if tax revenue funds health or social programs in affected communities, the equity argument strengthens. Industry adaptation continues, switching to non-nutritive sweeteners, smaller package sizes, shifting marketing to less regulated channels, funding local sports or education programs to maintain brand goodwill. Trade policy and agricultural subsidies complicate everything. NAFTA reshaped sugar and corn syrup flows between the US and Mexico, sparking repeated disputes. The European Union's sugar regime, which long balanced beet and cane through quotas and subsidies, was reformed with quotas scrapped in 2017, affecting global prices and production decisions. In the US and EU, support systems for sugar and other crops have historically made certain ingredients cheaper than others, tilting food manufacturing toward sugar-rich, grain-based, ultra-processed products. Brazil's pro-alcohol program from the 1970s, aimed at producing ethanol from cane as a fuel alternative, further tied sugar landscapes to energy policy. Because sugar is embedded in trade agreements, farm bills, and regional development plans, reducing sugar consumption becomes not just a matter of health messaging, but of rethinking parts of the food and energy system. Looking ahead, we face both practical options and a larger ethical question. What do we do about the past? On the technical side, there are ways to soften sugar's health impact without banning pleasure. Non-nutritive sweeteners, saccharin, aspartame, sucralose, stevia derivatives, sugar alcohols offer sweetness with little or no calories. They allow manufacturers to cut sugar contents while preserving perceived sweetness. But trade-offs exist. Research continues on their effects on gut microbiota, appetite regulation, and long-term metabolic health. Even if risks prove small, they raise another issue: keeping palates habituated to high sweetness levels instead of shifting diets toward less sweetness overall. Supply-side measures offer quieter but more profound potential. Regenerative cane agriculture, minimizing burning, protecting soil carbon, integrating trees and biodiversity corridors, reducing chemical inputs, can shrink sugar's environmental footprint. Certification programs like Bon Sucro, founded in the late 2000s, set standards for labor, water, and emissions. Some mills in Brazil, Thailand, Australia, and elsewhere have embraced cogeneration, turning bagasse into power, and better water practices. However, certified sugar remains a small portion of the global total, and premiums often don't trickle down to the most vulnerable field workers. Without broader market and policy changes, there's a risk of green sugar becoming a niche product for affluent consumers, not a systemic fix. Reparations and structural redress speak directly to sugar's moral ledger. Emancipation-era decisions matter. Britain's 1833 Slavery Abolition Act freed enslaved people, but compensated slave owners with about 20 million, an enormous sum, then funded by British taxpayers. Those funds solidified planter fortunes and their metropolitan partners' wealth. France's 1825 indemnity demand on Haiti, in exchange for recognizing its independence, drained the first Black Republic for generations. In 2013, CARICOM, the Caribbean Community, created a reparations commission to detail harms and press for apologies, development support, and other redress from former colonial powers. Their arguments emphasized that slavery's economic legacy and ongoing disadvantages need more than symbolic acknowledgement. What could reparations look like in sugar's world? Several plausible routes exist. 1. Sugar taxes whose revenues are specifically earmarked for health, education, and infrastructure projects in regions historically shaped by plantation economies: Haiti, Jamaica, Barbados, Guyana, Mauritius, and beyond. 2. Land reform funds designed to transfer or buy back former plantation lands into community or cooperative ownership, with support for diversification into other crops and forms of income. 3. Investment in historical truth-telling museums, archives, educational materials that fully chart sugar's entanglement with slavery, forced labor, and corporate profit. Projects like UCL's Legacies of British Slave Ownership database and the Slave Voyages project show how much there is to document. Practically, reparations might include endowments for Caribbean public health systems, scholarship programs for descendants of enslaved people, and preferential trade access for products that help diversify away from monocrop dependence. Policymakers can also realign incentives going forward. Meaningful sugar excises high enough to change producer behavior, not just consumer receipts, paired with transparent, locally controlled spending of revenues, can strengthen trust. Clear front-of-pack warnings, mandatory, not voluntary, make it harder for companies to hide added sugars. Restricting junk food and sugary drink marketing in spaces heavily populated by children TV cartoon blocks, digital platforms, schools can chip away at lifelong marketing advantages. At the same time, redirecting agricultural subsidies away from overproducing sugar and toward fruits, vegetables, legumes, and whole grains would rebalance the playing field, making healthier foods more competitive. Citizens and historians both have ongoing roles. Historians can keep bringing archives to light compensation lists, corporate minutes, industry PR campaigns, and making them accessible and intelligible to the public. Scholars like Kristin Kearns have already shown how earlier industry meddling in nutrition science shaped decades of public policy. Similar work can be done on trade deals and corporate lobbying. That work can support legal and political claims for reparations and reform. Citizens can insist that sugar tax revenues stay in health and education budgets, that supermarkets prioritize fresh produce affordability instead of constant promos on ultra-processed snacks, that public institutions, schools, hospitals, prisons set food standards aligned with health goals. Communities tied up in sugar production should be central in discussions of transition. Many plantations are also villages. Livelihoods and identities still revolve around cane. A just transition needs to protect and support those workers. That means transition funds, from levies, corporate contributions, climate finance, earmarked for retraining, community-owned farm co-ops, small-scale processing facilities for diversified crops, and local infrastructure like cold storage and irrigation. Certification schemes are only meaningful when backed by enforceable labor protections and fair benefit sharing that actually reaches field workers, not just management and international brand owners. As we imagine a future with less harmful sugar and more justice, we have to be candid about the limits of individual choice. Lecturing families about cake won't solve structural problems. Cultural change requires money, law, and ritual. But small actions accumulate. A parent in Kingston deciding to use a little less sugar in Christmas cakes. A museum in Liverpool or Nantes mounting a permanent exhibit on sugar and slavery. A city council using soda tax revenue to fund free breakfast programs. Industry will adapt, as always. The aim of public policy should not be to annihilate sweetness, but to shape corporate adaptation toward lower harm and greater fairness, rather than letting companies alone determine what the future tastes like. Where then does sweetness go? Ideally, it becomes more modest, more conscious, more transparent about where it comes from and who pays for it. It doesn't vanish. It steps back from being a hidden preservative and default filler. In a small-town bakery, recipes slowly change. In school cafeterias, sugar-sweetened drinks disappear. In São Paulo, a cane co-op earning a Bon Sucro label sells into a market that pays for sustainable practice and uses some of that premium to support clinics and reforest riparian strips. Reparative work will be slow and messily bureaucratic. Lawsuits and diplomatic initiatives will take years. The moral work will take longer, but each hearing, each policy change, each museum caption is a stitch in a long repair job. The last irony is unexpectedly sweet. A commodity that once fueled empires, paid off creditors, demanded indemnities from newly freed nations, underwrote industrialization, and helped load modern societies with chronic disease might yet help fund a more just world. A sugar tax can pay for a village clinic. A product reformulation can lower a child's diabetes risk. A historically honest exhibit can change how visitors understand an old port's beauty. None of these look dramatic. They are incremental, technical, sometimes dull. But taken together, they begin to rewrite sugar's story from a pamphlet of exploitation to a tentative promise. So when the candles burn low and the last piece of pastry waits on its plate, think about the journey that bite has taken to reach you. The soil and the mill, the shipping manifest and the oven, the chartered ship and the health guideline, the small rituals of sharing that make strangers into neighbors. Taste that history and consider the possibility that sweetness can be made not only less damaging to bodies and ecosystems, but also more honest and more just toward the people who raised it. Tomorrow, the world will spin with the same old appetite. Tonight, the Forbidden Dispensary invites you to rest on a slower hope, that we can adjust rituals, rewrite rules, and replant fields in ways that bring better health and fairer reward to the table. It is deeply human to crave something sweet and deeply human too, to want that sweetness to finally be deserved.